Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I never imagined how one wrong turn on a lonely road would lead me here. Trapped beneath the earth in darkness so thick it felt alive, creeping over my skin like invisible fingers. Yet here I am, flashlight trembling in my hand, every breath coming harder, shallow, as if the walls themselves are closing in. My heart pounds so loudly it drowns out the distant drip of water echoing down the tunnels, each drop a reminder of how far underground I am, how far from help. It all started with a detour, one of those backroad shortcuts that only locals know. Except I wasn't a local. I was just another lost traveler trying to shave time off my journey back home from a weekend in the mountains. My GPS had died hours ago and my phone had no signal. That's when I saw it, a small road sign pointing to a forgotten town called Hollow Point. Sounded quaint enough, like one of those sleepy, tucked-away places where life was slower, the air crisper. My tank was running low, and I figured it would be a good place to stop for gas. The road that led there wound through thick forests, with trees so close they almost seemed to swallow the road. Fog began to roll in, thick and unnatural, obscuring everything beyond a few feet ahead. By the time I reached the town, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faintest glow on the edges of the sky. Hollow Point looked as if time had forgotten it. Crumbling old buildings, deserted streets, not a single sign of life. But what really unsettled me was the absolute, unnatural quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, not even the hum of insects. Just silence. I drove around looking for a gas station, but there was nothing. Just empty streets and boarded-up windows. Something about the place didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the eerie quiet. Maybe it was the fog thickening into an oppressive blanket. Or maybe it was the way my headlights seemed to dim as if the darkness was swallowing them whole. All I knew was that I wanted to leave. That's when I saw the tunnel. It sat at the edge of town, carved into the hillside like a gaping mouth, half obscured by creeping vines and shadow. A hand-painted sign above it read, "Mining tunnels. No trespassing." But beneath that, another sign, barely visible, promised, "Tourist entrance this way." Relief washed over me. If there were tourist tunnels, maybe the town wasn't as deserted as it seemed. Maybe I could find someone, ask for directions, or at least a phone signal. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out of the car and approached the entrance. The air felt different as I neared it. Heavier, colder, like the atmosphere shifted the moment I crossed some invisible threshold. But I pressed on. As soon as I stepped inside, the quiet of the town was amplified tenfold. The world outside disappeared, replaced by the claustrophobic silence of the earth. The tunnel walls, once worked over by miners' hands, now appeared jagged, as if something else had been clawing at them, trying to get out. The beam of my flashlight flickered against the rock, casting shadows that danced unnaturally, like they were waiting for me to turn my back. I walked deeper, calling out for anyone, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Just the rhythmic drip of water somewhere ahead, and the suffocating stillness all around. After what felt like hours, the narrow passage opened into a larger cavern, illuminated by faint flickering bulbs strung along the ceiling. Someone had been here recently, I thought, because the light still worked. That's when I saw the signs, rusted old arrows pointing in different directions. One pointed toward a gift shop long since collapsed. Another pointed toward the depths. Something about that word made me stop cold. Depths. Why did it sound like a warning? Ignoring the gnawing unease, I turned to head back, but the tunnel behind me was gone. I shined my flashlight around, trying to find the way I came, but all I saw were walls closing in from every side. My mind raced. I hadn't turned far enough to lose track of where I came from. Had I? I took a step forward, trying to retrace my steps, but it was like the tunnel itself was shifting, warping, alive. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief second of darkness, I heard something. A whisper, barely audible, a hissing voice that echoed around me, too faint to catch words, but unmistakably human. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice came back hollow, absorbed by the oppressive stone. No answer. The drip of water grew louder, too loud. Like it wasn't just dripping now, but rushing toward me, a torrent I couldn't see. I backed away, the flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to stay calm, trying to stay sane. Then came the footsteps, faint at first, but unmistakable, the shuffle of someone walking, dragging, just beyond the reach of my light. I whipped the beam toward the sound, expecting to see a figure, but there was nothing. The tunnel yawned ahead, empty, mocking me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, circling me. Panicking, I spun in place, desperate to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the light, just barely visible, a figure. Not a person, at least not anymore. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes, wide and hollow, were fixed on me with an intensity that turned my blood to ice. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette with tangled strings shuffling forward with every breath I took. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the earth. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away from that thing. But the faster I ran, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch, as if it was pulling me deeper, refusing to let me escape. And always, I could hear it behind me. Its ragged breathing, its unnatural footsteps echoing in the dark. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, my body gave out. I collapsed against the cold, damp wall, gasping for breath, flashlight long since dead. The darkness swallowed me whole, and then in that suffocating black, I heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but laughter. Low, guttural, and filled with malice. It echoed through the tunnels, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I tried to move, tried to scream, but my body refused to obey. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thinner, colder, until I could barely breathe. And then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, peeking from the cracks in the walls, their eyes wide with hunger, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. They were watching me, waiting, as if they knew something I didn't. A hand, cold and bony, brushed against my arm. I screamed. The tunnel erupted into chaos. The walls groaned and cracked, the ground beneath me shook violently, and the faces, they moved. Crawling out of the walls, their twisted bodies writhing toward me, their laughter growing louder, more frenzied. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the darkness, my hands scraping against the jagged stone. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get out. But the laughter followed me. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, it was always there, chasing me, mocking me. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling through the air before landing hard on cold, wet stone. Pain shot through my leg, but I couldn't stop. I crawled, pulling myself through the mud, until my hands found a metal ladder. I didn't think. I just climbed. Up and up, the air growing colder, the laughter fading, until finally, I saw a faint glimmer of light. I scrambled out of the hole, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. I was outside. I was safe. But as I lay there, staring up at the sky, I realized something. The laughter hadn't stopped. It was faint, distant, but still there. It was inside me now. I always thought those tales about cursed objects were just stories told to frighten children or gullible tourists, like urban legends meant to keep people from venturing too far off the beaten path. But after what happened to me, I can tell you for certain that some legends hold more truth than we're willing to admit. It all began with an innocent find. I had been scouring through antique shops for years, hunting for rare books, old manuscripts, anything unusual. That's how I came across the little shop on a remote back street in Salem. It didn't have a flashy name or even a welcoming appearance. In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. The door was set deep into the wall, and the windows were grimy with age. But there was something about it, something that called to me. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper. Shelves overflowed with ancient tomes, their leather covers worn and cracked, and relics from forgotten times were stacked precariously in corners. A dim light filtered through a dusty chandelier, barely illuminating the space. It was like stepping into another era, one where time itself had forgotten to pass. The shopkeeper was an old woman with eyes that glittered like black stones. She didn't say much, didn't need to. Her gaze followed me as I wandered through the maze of shelves. But she didn't interfere. I could feel her watching me though, like she knew I'd find exactly what I was looking for. And I did. Hidden beneath a pile of old diaries and weathered maps, I found the book. Its cover was plain, blackened leather that felt oddly warm to the touch. There were no markings on it, no title, no author's name. Just an intricate, faded symbol embossed in the center that I couldn't quite make out. Something about it felt wrong, but also irresistible. My curiosity got the better of me, as it always does, and I picked it up. As soon as my fingers brushed the cover, a chill ran down my spine. I hesitated, but then I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I'd spent enough time around old books to know that sometimes they carried an eerie sense of history with them. But this one felt different, heavier, as if the weight of all the lives it had touched hung in the air around it. I brought the book to the counter. The shopkeeper didn't ask me why I wanted it or offer any information. She simply rang me up with a grim smile, and as I handed her the money, she said, "Be careful with that one. It's not like the others." A warning perhaps, but I brushed it off. I was no stranger to superstition, and I certainly didn't believe in cursed objects. I was more intrigued by the mystery of the book itself than by any folklore attached to it. When I got home, I set the book on my desk and examined it more closely. It was old, no doubt about that, but it was in surprisingly good condition given its age. The pages were yellowed but intact, the binding firm. The faded symbol on the cover bothered me though. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed to shift, as if the lines were alive, pulsing slightly in the dim light of my study. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It was probably just the strain of looking at something that had weathered centuries of time. I hesitated for a moment before opening the book. As I did, a draft seemed to sweep through the room, though the windows were closed. The first few pages were blank, their surfaces smooth and untouched. Then, just as I was about to flip to another, words began to appear, faint at first, then growing bolder. They were written in a language I didn't recognize, the script curling and jagged like the writing of someone deeply disturbed or possessed. But what was even stranger was the way the words seemed to rearrange themselves if I stared too long. Sentences bent and warped, twisting into new meanings, as though the book was trying to communicate directly with me, slipping into my mind and embedding itself there. That night, I dreamed of the witch. She stood at the edge of a forest, her figure shrouded in a black cloak. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel her eyes, piercing, watching me. In her hands, she held the book, and the symbol on the cover glowed with an eerie light, casting long shadows over her gaunt figure. I tried to move, to speak, but I was rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed under her gaze. She raised the book, pointing it toward me, and a deep, guttural voice filled the air, speaking in that same twisted language from the pages. Then, without warning, she opened the book, and a dark, swirling mist poured out, engulfing me, suffocating me. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The dream was so vivid, so real, that for a moment I thought I could still hear her voice echoing in the corners of my room. I sat up, trying to shake the feeling. But there was something wrong. The room felt different, heavy, like the air had thickened. And then I saw it. The book. It was open. I was certain I had closed it before going to bed, but now it lay there, its pages spread wide, and the strange symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dark. My skin prickled with unease. Slowly, I approached the desk and closed the book. But even as I did, I felt something watching me. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the dream or the book. I tried to work, tried to go about my day, but it was no use. The book called to me, its presence in my apartment an unbearable weight that pressed on my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of my imagination, that I was letting my obsession get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The dreams continued. Every night the witch came closer, her voice louder, her words sharper, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Each time the mist grew darker, thicker, suffocating me until I could barely breathe. And always in her hands was the book. It wasn't long before the hallucinations started. At first, it was just shadows, flickers of movement at the edges of my vision, shapes that didn't belong. But soon, they became more. I would see the witch standing in the corners of rooms, her face obscured by that ever-present hood, her eyes glowing with malevolence. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, she was always there, watching. One night, as I sat in my study, trying desperately to focus on anything but the book, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder, I recognized the voice from my dreams. The witch. "Read," she whispered, the words slithering through the air like a serpent. "Read, and know." I turned toward the book, my hands trembling. It lay on the desk, closed. But I could feel it, like a pulse, a beating heart, waiting for me to open it. And against all reason, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I did. This time, the words didn't twist. They didn't shift or change. They were clear, and as I read them, a coldness spread through me, chilling me to the bone. The text described a curse, an ancient curse placed on anyone who dared to possess the book. It spoke of a witch long dead, a practitioner of dark magic who had bound her soul to the pages. Her power was sealed within, waiting to be unleashed by the foolish and the curious. And I had been both. The curse, the text explained, would consume the reader, slowly driving them to madness. First through dreams, then through visions. And finally, the witch herself would come to claim her victim, dragging their soul into the book, where it would be trapped for all eternity, just as she had been. I dropped the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. It couldn't be real. It was just a story, just an old legend. But as the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, closing in on me, I knew. It was real. I had to get rid of it. I had to break the curse. But the book wouldn't let me. I tried to burn it, but the flames wouldn't catch. I tried to tear it apart, but the pages were indestructible, no matter how hard I pulled. The witch's whispers grew louder, her presence stronger, and I knew my time was running out. In desperation, I returned to the shop, the place where I had found the cursed object. But when I arrived, the shop was gone, vanished as though it had never existed. There was nothing but an empty alleyway where it had once stood. No sign, no door, no trace of the woman who had sold me the book. And now, I am here, trapped. The witch is close. I can feel her. She's been in every corner of my mind, whispering, laughing, waiting for the moment when she will finally claim me. I can see her now, standing at the edge of the room, her hood pulled low, the glowing symbol on the book shining through the darkness. There's no escape. The curse is too powerful, too deeply rooted in my soul. I can hear the pages rustling, calling for me, calling for the final chapter to be written. I've come to accept my fate. The book wants me, and soon it will have me. And once it does, it will want Yuman-san next. There's something deeply unsettling about dolls. Maybe it's the lifeless eyes that seem to follow you around the room, or the frozen, eerie smiles that feel too much like the echo of some hidden malice. I never liked them, even as a kid. I would beg my parents not to bring them home, but no matter how many times I voiced my fear, my mother loved collecting them. It wasn't until much later in life, after everything happened, that I understood why. The collection had been growing for years. My mother's fascination started small: porcelain dolls, vintage toys, and handmade cloth figures, each one with a story that seemed to matter only to her. She'd display them on shelves, in cabinets, in every spare corner of our house. By the time I was 10, the dolls practically had a room of their own. That was when I began to notice strange things happening around them, though I never told anyone. I didn't want to sound ridiculous. Looking back, maybe I should have. I had moved out long ago, left the dolls and the childhood home behind, and thought I had finally escaped the strange feeling that always hung around those dead-eyed toys. But everything changed after my mother's sudden death. It was unexpected, a heart attack in the middle of the night, and I found myself back in that house, surrounded by all the things I'd hoped to never see again. The day I arrived for the funeral, the house felt different. It wasn't just the weight of grief. There was something else, a heaviness that seemed to press against my chest as soon as I stepped through the door. The dolls were still there, of course, in their usual places. But now, without my mother bustling about, they felt alive. I could have sworn the air in the room shifted slightly when I entered, like the dolls were reacting to my presence. It started small, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I'd be sitting in the living room, going through old photographs, and I'd think I saw one of the dolls' heads turn ever so slightly, or a pair of glassy eyes shifting to follow me. I told myself it was just the strain of everything, the funeral planning, the overwhelming loss. But the longer I stayed in that house, the harder it was to dismiss. On the second night after I arrived, I woke up to a faint sound. It was late, close to 3 a.m., and the house was silent, except for a strange, soft shuffling. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows or maybe a mouse scurrying in the walls. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It was a rhythmic tapping, like tiny feet running across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now, and it was coming from down the hall, from the room where my mother kept the dolls. I grabbed my phone, its screen casting a cold glow in the dark, and turned on the flashlight. My pulse raced as I slipped out of bed, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The hallway was empty, but the tapping continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I approached the doll room slowly, my heart in my throat. As I reached for the door handle, the tapping stopped. Complete silence fell over the house. My hand shook as I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me sent a cold chill down my spine. The dolls were all arranged in their usual spots, on shelves, seated in small chairs, some even propped against the wall. But they had been moved, I was sure of it. They were facing the wrong way, looking out toward the door instead of toward the corners where they'd always sat. It was as if they had all turned to face me, their vacant eyes staring, waiting. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, in the dim light of my phone, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the dolls, a small porcelain figure dressed in a frilly pink gown, had been placed in the middle of the floor. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as I stood there, I realized it hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. My hands trembled as I knelt to pick it up. As soon as I touched it, a sharp pain shot through my palm. I yanked my hand back and saw a thin, deep cut, blood welling up from the gash. The doll's fingers, delicate and pale, were pointed and sharp, almost like claws. I dropped it and stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning with disbelief. I wanted to convince myself it was all some bizarre coincidence, that my exhaustion and grief were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I called my aunt. She had been close with my mother, and I figured she could help me deal with the house and the unsettling collection of dolls. When she arrived, I told her about the strange noises, the doll in the middle of the floor, and the cut on my hand. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern, but I could see a shadow of something darker behind her eyes. "You didn't know, did you?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Know what?" I asked, the unease in my stomach growing. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "Your mother was interested in more than just collecting dolls. She had a fascination with the occult. It started as a hobby, something innocent, but over time, she got deeper into it. She started buying dolls that had histories, dark histories, cursed dolls, possessed objects." I stared at her, the words barely sinking in. "Cursed?" I repeated, my voice shaky. "Possessed?" My aunt nodded. She believed that some of the dolls were vessels, homes for spirits or worse. She thought she could control them, keep them safe. But I think they've been waiting for her to die. A cold dread washed over me as her words sank in. The idea was absurd, but after the last few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to what she was saying. "Your mother had a journal," my aunt continued. "She kept it hidden, but I'm sure it's still here. If you can find it, maybe you can understand what's going on and how to stop it." The rest of the day passed in a haze as we searched through my mother's things, looking for the journal. Hours slipped by, and just when I was about to give up, I found it, tucked away in a small drawer in her bedroom, hidden beneath old scarves and trinkets. The leather-bound book was worn, its pages filled with scrawling handwriting. As I flipped through, my stomach turned. It was filled with notes on rituals, symbols, and incantations. My mother had been deeply involved in the occult, much more than I ever realized. She had been collecting these dolls not for their beauty, but for their power. Each one was tied to a spirit, some benevolent, but others were not. One passage caught my eye, written in large, shaky letters. It described a particular doll, one that was more dangerous than the rest, a vessel for something dark and malevolent. According to the journal, my mother had found it at an estate sale, its previous owner having died under mysterious circumstances. She had kept it locked away, trying to contain whatever was inside. The description matched the doll I had found in the middle of the floor the night before. I felt sick. I didn't want to believe it, but everything lined up too perfectly. The strange noises, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. The doll wasn't just an object. It was alive, or at least something inside it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, sitting in the living room, staring at the door to the doll room. The journal lay open on the table in front of me, the words blurring together as exhaustion weighed on me. But I didn't dare close my eyes. I knew something was coming. I could feel it. Just after midnight, the tapping started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, the flashlight in my hand trembling. I moved toward the hallway, the sound growing louder with every step. As I reached the door to the doll room, the tapping stopped again, replaced by a soft, eerie whispering. It was like 100 voices speaking at once, too quiet to understand but filled with malice. I opened the door slowly, my hands shaking. The dolls were exactly where I had left them earlier that day. except for one. The porcelain doll in the pink gown was standing now, not sitting, not lying on the floor. Standing. In the center of the room, its tiny glass eyes fixed on me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, the doll's head jerked to the side and a slow, twisted grin spread across its face. I screamed and slammed the door, running back to the living room. My mind raced. I had to get rid of it, of all of them. I couldn't stay in this house another second. But as I turned to grab my keys, I saw them. The dolls. They had moved. Every single one of them was now standing in the hallway, their cold, glassy eyes staring at me, their faces twisted into horrible, lifelike expressions. They were coming for me. The tapping grew louder, faster, surrounding me from every direction. I backed into the corner of the room, my pulse thundering in my ears. The doll in the pink gown stepped forward, its tiny feet clicking on the wooden floor, its grin growing wider, more sinister. I closed my eyes, clutching the journal to my chest, and whispered a prayer, hoping, pleading that it would be enough to stop them. But the last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of their tiny, cold hands reaching for me. To this day, no one has been able to explain what happened in that house. The dolls remain there, untouched, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross their path. And I can only hope that no one else will be foolish enough to answer their call. Because once you encounter them, they never let you go. I don't believe in curses, and up until a few months ago, I thought ghost stories were just that, stories. My name is Lucas Martin, and I'm a 32-year-old antiques dealer from Brooklyn. I've always had a fascination with old things, relics from the past that carry stories long forgotten. But some objects, I've learned, should remain lost to time. This is one of those stories. It started when I received a call from a widow in upstate New York. She was downsizing after her husband's sudden death and wanted to sell a few items that had been in their family for generations. Intrigued, I agreed to meet her in her Victorian-era mansion, tucked deep within the Catskill Mountains. The house itself was impressive, but had that aura of decay that comes from too many memories, too much history. There was an air of sadness about the place, as if the very walls were mourning. But what caught my eye wasn't the house or its ornate furniture. It was a mirror, a large, intricately framed piece tucked away in a corner of the sitting room. The frame was dark wood, etched with symbols I didn't recognize, and the glass itself was flawless, despite being at least a century old. It wasn't just its beauty that pulled me toward it, though. It was something else. An unexplainable force that made my breath catch and my heart pound just a little faster. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," the widow warned, her voice wavering as if she knew something she didn't want to share. "That mirror, it's not like the others." I chuckled, brushing off her concern as superstition. "It's beautiful," I said. "Do you know where it came from?" She hesitated, her eyes darkening with what looked like fear. "It belonged to my husband's family for generations. They say it shows more than just your reflection." I should have listened to her then, should have walked away. But I didn't. A week later, the mirror was hanging in my apartment. I had polished the wood frame and cleaned the glass until it gleamed. It gave the room a touch of elegance, and despite the widow's warning, I felt no fear in owning it. In fact, I found myself drawn to it more and more each day. The first strange occurrence happened late one night. I was lying in bed, my mind racing with the usual clutter of thoughts that come when the world is quiet and you're alone with yourself. That's when I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no draft in the apartment. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The mirror stood across from my bed, its surface reflecting the room. But as I stared at it, something changed. The reflection wasn't quite right. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if they were moving on their own. And then, in the corner of the glass, I saw it. A figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I forced myself to look back at the mirror, but the figure was gone, and everything appeared normal again. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me in the middle of the night. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though I could never make out what they were saying. And the figure, always just a shadow, always just out of reach, began appearing more often. Sometimes it stood in the corner of the room. Other times it lingered behind me as I worked at my desk. Each time I turned around, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but sleep began to elude me. I would wake up in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched so intense that I could hardly breathe. The mirror, once a beautiful piece of history, now felt like a curse. But still, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Then, one evening, I made the mistake of staring into it for too long. I was sitting on the couch, a drink in hand, trying to unwind after another restless day. The mirror hung across from me, reflecting the room, as it always did. But as I stared at it, something shifted. My reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, staring back at me with hollow eyes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection grinned. It wasn't me. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The smile stretched too wide, the eyes too dark. And then, without warning, the reflection moved toward the glass, its hand pressing against the surface as if it was trying to break through. The glass didn't shatter, but it rippled like water disturbed by a stone. I jumped to my feet, knocking over my drink in the process. The reflection, no, the thing in the mirror, laughed. It was a hollow, distorted sound, echoing in the room even though my own mouth remained closed. In a panic, I grabbed the nearest object, a book from the coffee table, and hurled it at the mirror. It hit with a dull thud and fell to the floor. But the mirror didn't break. The surface rippled once more, and the figure in the glass disappeared, leaving only my wide-eyed reflection staring back at me. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I covered the mirror with a sheet, hoping that would be enough to stop whatever was happening. But it didn't. The whispers continued, louder now, angrier, and the figure, it began appearing outside the mirror. I would catch glimpses of it in the hallway or standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching me as I slept, always watching. I stopped sleeping altogether. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt its presence. I tried to get rid of the mirror, but every time I went to move it, the whispers would start, pleading with me, threatening me. I felt trapped, as if the mirror had taken control of my life. Then, last night, everything came to a head. I woke up to find the sheet covering the mirror torn to shreds, lying in a heap on the floor. The mirror itself was glowing faintly, a sickly, unnatural light emanating from the glass, and standing in front of it was the figure. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was there, in my room, tall and dark, its eyes burning with malice. It stepped toward me, and I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. The whispers surrounded me, a cacophony of voices telling me to look, to see what the mirror wanted to show me. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. My body moved on its own, turning toward the mirror, and there, reflected in the glass, was my death. I saw myself, pale and lifeless, lying on the floor with that same grotesque grin stretched across my face. Blood pooled around me, and the figure stood over my body, its hand reaching out to touch my face. I blinked, and the vision was gone. But the figure remained. I don't know how I escaped that night. I must have blacked out because when I woke up, the mirror was shattered, the glass scattered across the floor, but the whispers, they haven't stopped. And now every time I look into a mirror, any mirror. I see it. The figure. Waiting. Watching. I can't escape it. And neither can you. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After my divorce, I needed a change, something to shake the dust off my life and move me away from the constant reminder of failure. So, when I found the old Victorian house nestled on the outskirts of town, I thought it was a sign. A fixer-upper, sure, but it had potential. The wide porch wrapped around the entire house. The turrets gave it a fairy tale charm, and the price was ridiculously low. Too low, if I'm being honest. People say it's cursed. The realtor had laughed nervously as she handed me the keys. The last few owners, well, they didn't stay long. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I chalked it up to small-town gossip, old superstitions that cling to these types of places. Besides, I wasn't the superstitious type. If anything, the mystery of the house intrigued me more. I'd always been drawn to places with history, places that had stories buried in the walls. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking boxes and trying to ignore the ever-growing list of repairs the house demanded. Every room needed work. Leaky pipes, sagging floorboards, cracked windows. But I didn't mind. It was something to focus on, something to take my mind off everything I was leaving behind. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. But then, the noises started. It was subtle at first. Creaks and groans in the middle of the night. I wrote it off as the house settling, the old bones of the structure adjusting to my presence. But the sounds grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the floorboards or the wind outside. It was deeper than that, like the house itself was shifting, moving in ways I couldn't quite explain. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a distinct thud from downstairs. It was heavy, like something had fallen, a chair tipping over or a door slamming shut. My heart jumped into my throat, but I forced myself to investigate. The house was cold as I descended the stairs, the air thick and stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years. In the living room, I found nothing out of place. Everything was as I'd left it, the old furniture covered in sheets, the boxes stacked neatly by the wall, but the sound lingered in the air, a faint, reverberating echo, like something had shifted just beyond my field of vision. The next morning, I found something strange. In the corner of the living room, one of the floorboards had split, revealing a jagged crack that ran several feet across the floor. I knelt down, running my hand over the wood. It wasn't just a crack, it was a gap, like something had pried the boards apart from beneath. I told myself it was just the age of the house, maybe a weak foundation, but the unease settled in my chest like a weight. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of something scraping. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat that had gotten trapped in the walls. But the more I listened, the more unnatural it sounded. It was a steady, rhythmic noise, like claws raking against the wood, but it was coming from under the floor. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I descended into the cold, damp air. The basement was unfinished, with dirt floors and exposed beams, and the smell of mold was overwhelming. As I moved the light across the walls, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The floorboards above me were shifting. I watched, horrified, as the wood seemed to ripple, bending and warping as if it were alive. The scraping sound grew louder, and the boards above my head buckled, swelling like something was pressing up from beneath. For a moment, I was frozen, unsure of what I was seeing. Then, without warning, one of the boards split open with a sickening crack, and I saw something move. A hand, long, pale fingers, thin and bony, reaching up through the gap in the floor. It was slow, deliberate, feeling its way along the edges of the broken wood. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I watched, helpless, as more of the hand emerged, followed by an arm, then a shoulder. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The skin was too pale, almost translucent, and the way it moved was unnatural, like it was gliding rather than crawling. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the steps as I raced back up to the main floor, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, panting, my hand still gripping the doorknob. The house was silent again, but the memory of that thing, whatever it was burned into my mind. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed to get out, to never come back. But something kept me there. The house had a hold on me, a pull I couldn't quite explain. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that I hadn't really seen what I thought I had. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was losing my mind. After all, I'd been under a lot of stress lately. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The following days were a blur. I tried to continue with the renovations, but every time I worked, I could feel the house watching me. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor groaned beneath my feet, and that scraping sound, it never stopped. It was always there, just at the edge of my hearing, growing louder at night, more insistent. Then one morning, I found the first room. I had been trying to clean out the attic, clearing away years of dust and debris, when I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was tucked away in the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was small, barely big enough to crawl through, and the wood was old and rotting. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to pull it open. The door groaned on its hinges, and a wave of stale, musty air hit me in the face. I shone my flashlight into the opening, expecting to find a crawl space or some forgotten storage area. But what I found was far worse. The room was small, barely more than a few feet wide, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. But it was the floor that caught my attention. It wasn't made of wood or stone like the rest of the house. It was made of bones. I recoiled, the light trembling in my hand as I realized what I was seeing. Human bones, piled in neat rows, their brittle yellowed surfaces gleaming in the dim light. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all arranged with a precision that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't just the bones. There was something else in the room, something moving. In the far corner, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. It was thin, emaciated. Its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were wide, empty, staring at me with a hollow, hungry gaze. And then it smiled, a twisted, broken smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. I slammed the door shut and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I leaned against the porch, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The house was wrong. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it fed on people. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I didn't. I couldn't. The house had its claws in me, and no matter how much I wanted to run, something kept pulling me back. I spent the next few nights locked in my room, barricading the door, but it didn't matter. The house was patient. It was waiting. On the third night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the halls. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I listened to the sound grow closer. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and then I heard it. A soft, scratching noise, like nails scraping against the wood. I held my breath, praying that whatever was out there would go away, but deep down I knew it wouldn't. The door creaked open, and I saw it, the same figure from the attic, standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It smiled again, that same twisted grin, and took a step forward. And that's when I realized the truth. The house didn't just eat people, it turned them into something else. Something wrong, something that would never leave. The figure took another step toward me, its hand reaching out, and I felt the pull again. The same pull that had kept me there, that had drawn me to the house in the first place. It wasn't just hunger, it was possession. The house wasn't just alive, it was in control, and now it wanted me. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The house is closing in on me and I can feel myself slipping. The walls pulse with a life of their own, the floor shifts beneath my feet, and that scratching sound. It never stops. It's only a matter of time before I become one of them, before the house eats me too. There's a reason people don't go into the woods after dark in my hometown. They don't talk about it much anymore, but everyone knows. The shadows seem darker there, the air colder, and if you listen closely, you can hear the distant howl of something unnatural, something hungry. I know because I've heard it myself. I never used to believe in such things. It all seemed like superstitious nonsense until one night, when I came face to face with what lurks in those woods. It started like any normal Friday night. My friends and I were at the local bar, swapping stories about the old legends of the town. There's always been talk of strange things happening near the forest, disappearances, strange sightings, but no one could ever agree on what it was. Some said it was an animal, a wolf maybe. Others swore it was something far worse. We laughed it off like we always did. I wish I'd taken it more seriously. After a few beers, someone dared me to go out there. I don't know if it was the alcohol or my pride, but I accepted. "What's the worst that could happen?" I joked, grabbing my coat. They laughed too. No one actually thought I would do it, but the truth was I was curious. I wanted to see for myself if there was any truth to the stories. I walked out of the bar, my breath visible in the cool night air. The woods loomed at the edge of town, the treetops swaying slightly in the breeze. As I approached, the sounds of the town faded behind me, swallowed by the quiet of the forest. The further I walked, the more the trees seemed to close in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. At first, it was just the normal sounds of the woods, leaves rustling, the occasional owl hooting. But then the wind stopped. Everything went silent. The air felt thick, oppressive. That's when I heard it, a low growl, barely audible but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the darkness around me. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. I shook it off and kept walking, though my legs felt heavier with each step. I'd made it about a mile into the woods when I saw something. At first it looked like a shadow moving between the trees. I froze, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Then I saw it again, clearer this time. Something large and hunched, its body unnaturally twisted. It moved fast, too fast for me to get a good look. Fear crept up my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. I started to turn back, but the moment I did, I heard it again. The growl. Only this time it was much closer. My pulse quickened, and I began walking faster, my feet crunching on the dead leaves below. But the thing followed me. I could feel it. I broke into a run. The sounds behind me grew louder, snapping branches, heavy footfalls. It wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. I could hear its breathing now, ragged and wet, like something not quite human. My lungs burned as I ran faster, dodging trees and trying to find my way out. And then I tripped. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. For a second, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes staring at me from the shadows, unblinking and predatory. It stepped into the moonlight, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The creature was massive, its body covered in matted fur that was slick with something dark and foul. Its head was too large for its body, twisted at an unnatural angle, with a snout full of jagged, blood-stained teeth. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I were staring into the face of pure evil. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The creature lunged at me, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I felt a sharp pain in my leg as its claws raked through my flesh, and I screamed. I tried to fight it off, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. It was too strong, too powerful. Just when I thought it was over, a loud crack echoed through the woods. The creature let out a howl of rage and stumbled back, its eyes flashing with fury. Another crack followed, and this time I recognized it, the sound of a gunshot. Someone was shooting at it. The creature snarled and retreated into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I lay there, gasping for breath, blood pouring from the gash in my leg. I thought I was hallucinating from the pain when I saw an old man emerge from the shadows, a shotgun in his hands. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice gruff but filled with concern. "That thing's been hunting these woods for years. You're lucky to be alive." He helped me up, and together we hobbled out of the woods. The pain in my leg was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the terror of knowing that creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We didn't speak much as we made our way back to town. I asked him what the creature was, but he just shook his head. "Some things aren't meant to be understood," he muttered. "But you'll never be the same after seeing it. None of us are." When we reached the edge of the woods, I could see the lights of the town in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The old man stopped and turned to me, his eyes filled with a haunted look. "Don't ever come back here," he warned. "And don't tell anyone what you saw. They won't believe you, and even if they did, they'd never understand. That thing, it doesn't just haunt the woods. It haunts those who survive." I nodded, too shaken to argue. He walked me back to my car, and I drove home in silence, the events of the night playing over and over in my mind. I never told anyone what happened, just like the old man said. But I can still feel it, that thing out there, watching, waiting. Every now and then, late at night, I hear it again, the growl, faint and distant, carried on the wind. And I know, deep down, that one day it will come for me again. It was my last summer before leaving for college, and like most 18-year-olds, I felt invincible. My friends and I had decided to spend a weekend camping out in the deep woods near Lake Harrington. It was one of those places where everyone in town had a story. Stories about strange lights, missing people, and most notoriously, sightings of a creature known only as the Rake. I had heard the name whispered before, but never paid much attention. People like to scare each other with local legends, and the woods were the perfect backdrop for tall tales. My buddy Steve was the one who first suggested we go. "Come on, man. It'll be our last big adventure before everyone goes their separate ways," he said, cracking open a beer. Steve always had a way of convincing people, so we agreed. It was Steve, Jake, and me, 3 kids who had grown up in the same sleepy town, itching for a final thrill. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of drinks, and a sense of excitement as we headed out for what was supposed to be a fun weekend. The first day was exactly what you'd expect from a camping trip, setting up camp, fishing at the lake, and swapping stories around the fire as night fell. The woods were alive with the usual sounds, crickets, owls, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene even. But as the night wore on, something shifted. Around midnight, the woods became unnervingly silent. The crickets stopped chirping, the owls ceased their hoots, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. We sat around the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. Steve was the first to notice. "Is it just me, or is it too quiet?" he asked, looking around. I shrugged, but Jake nodded. "Yeah, man, it's weird. It's like everything just stopped." We laughed it off at first, attributing the silence to our overactive imaginations. But the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. The quiet was suffocating, unnatural. Then we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, like an animal, but not quite. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. Jake stood up, squinting into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Probably just a coyote, Steve said, trying to sound confident, though his voice cracked slightly. But we all knew that growl was too deep for a coyote, too deliberate. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was nothing, but something in the air had shifted. The fire no longer felt like a source of comfort, but a fragile shield against whatever was out there. An hour passed, maybe 2. Steve and Jake had gone to their tents, but I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of my tent, every noise amplified in the silence. And then, I heard it again. That growl, closer this time. I bolted upright, listening. The sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to echo all around us, surrounding our campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, hoping I was just imagining things. But when I stepped out, I saw Jake already out of his tent, looking as pale as I felt. "You heard it too?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's out there, man. I don't know what it is, but it's close." Steve stirred in his tent, waking up to our voices. "What's going on?" he asked groggily, rubbing his eyes. Before we could answer, a blood-curdling screech cut through the silence, freezing us in place. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. Part animal, part human, a sound so filled with malice that it made my blood run cold. Steve scrambled out of his tent and we all stood there, staring into the dark woods, too afraid to move. Then we saw it. A pale, emaciated figure crouched at the edge of the clearing, just outside the light of the fire. It was hunched over, almost crawling, its limbs long and unnatural, like a spider. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted out in sharp angles. But it was its face that truly terrified me. Its eyes were black pits, devoid of any emotion, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The creature, the rake, stood there, motionless, watching us. No one dared to speak. We didn't even breathe. It was as if making any noise would invite it closer. The fire crackled, the only sound breaking the tense silence. And for a moment I thought we might be safe, that the creature would retreat back into the woods. But then it moved. With terrifying speed, it darted forward, moving on all fours like some grotesque predator. Jake screamed and fell backward, scrambling to get away. Steve grabbed a stick from the fire and swung it in front of him, as if that would do anything to stop it. I just stood there, frozen, watching the creature as it circled us, eyes gleaming with a sick, predatory hunger. "Get in the tents," Steve shouted, but we all knew it was pointless. The thing could tear through the flimsy fabric in seconds. The rake stopped suddenly, standing eerily still once more, its head cocked to the side like it was considering something. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the woods, melting into the darkness as quickly as it had come. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like hours, too afraid to move or speak. None of us knew what had just happened, but we weren't about to stick around to find out. We packed up our gear as fast as we could, not caring about the noise anymore, and practically sprinted back to the car. By the time we reached the safety of the vehicle, dawn was beginning to break, but none of us felt relieved. We drove in silence, the weight of what we had seen hanging over us like a dark cloud. For weeks after that night, I tried to convince myself that it hadn't been real, that we had just imagined it, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, I saw those black, empty eyes staring back at me, felt the cold breath of the creature on my neck as it circled closer and closer. Jake refused to talk about it, and Steve changed after that night. He stopped coming out with us, stopped answering his phone. It was like he wanted to forget everything, to pretend that none of it had ever happened. I wish I could do the same. One night, a few weeks after our encounter, I got a call from Steve's mom. He had gone missing. She said he had gone back to the woods, alone, and never returned. They searched for him for days, but they never found a trace. No body, no gear, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I knew what had happened. We all did. The rake had come back for him. After Steve's disappearance, I couldn't take it anymore. I left town, moved away to college, far from the woods, far from the memories. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear that growl, faint and distant but unmistakable. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, the rake is never truly gone. It's waiting for me, just like it waited for Steve, and one day it will come for me too.